My name is Arthur Miller. I turned 79 this year. When people hear that number, I suppose they picture a man surrounded by his children and grandchildren, living out his days in a state of peaceful contentment. For me, however, that age is a monument to loneliness, a testament to a bitter lesson I learned about the bonds of family. I was never an ordinary man. I am the man who built an empire from absolutely nothing. I started in a forgotten corner of New York City, in a tiny sushi bar with only 2 tables tucked away on a lonely side street. From that humble beginning, I worked. I worked day and night, without rest, without holidays. Every piece of sushi I formed with my hands was more than just food. It was my passion. It was my art. It was the very soul of a craftsman. I dedicated my entire life to that work, to the profound and subtle dance of rice, fish, and seaweed. In time, my little shop earned a reputation. It grew and grew, becoming one of the most popular sushi chains in New York. And then it spread, with locations opening in other major cities across the country. I built a brilliant career for myself. I earned the respect of many people and became a recognized figure in the culinary world. I believed this was the natural reward for a lifetime of devotion, and that it would surely lead to a proud and tranquil old age. But now, in my later years, with my hair turned white and my back bent with age, I was presented with a demand. A demand to pay for a wedding gift for a granddaughter I had never seen, whose name I had never heard, whose very existence was a complete surprise to me. She was my granddaughter, and yet I, her grandfather, was treated like a complete and utter stranger. I was left off the guest list for my own grandchild's wedding, dismissed as an outsider and irrelevance. The only way I was invited to participate was to pay the bill for a diamond engagement ring that cost $52,000. It was an outrageous sum, a blatant and shameless demand, a humiliation that was almost impossible to bear. I held the invoice in my hand. It was just a thin slip of paper, but the cold, emotionless type and the stark, unfeeling numbers on it felt as heavy as a block of lead. I thought my heart might stop. The entire world around me seemed to fall silent. I just stood there, in my old office, the very room that had witnessed all my years of struggle and success. 10 seconds passed, but it felt like a century. In that brief span of time, a tidal wave of thoughts and feelings crashed over me. There was shock, then a sharp, piercing pain, then a wave of deep humiliation. And then, beneath it all, the quiet, steady flame of a burning anger began to glow. And so, I reached out my hand and picked up the phone. I called the bank directly. My fingers were trembling, but when I spoke, my voice was clear and firm. With not a trace of hesitation, "Cancel it." I paused for a second and took a deep breath, as if I were trying to force down all the emotions that were welling up inside me, to pack them away where they couldn't escape. "It's over." That was all I said. But those 2 simple words contained all of my disappointment, all of my resignation, and all of the cold, hard finality of my decision. I was done. I was done with the illusion of a happy family. I was done with the hope of spending a peaceful old age surrounded by children and grandchildren. I was done with this thing that called itself my family, and I was done with everything I had ever built for them. This all happened more than 30 years ago. But even now, every time I think about it, every time the scene and the words come back to me, my chest tightens as if it were only yesterday. The scar, though old, is still raw, still tender, still incredibly deep. And it was in that moment I realized something. I realized that there are some kinds of pain that time can never, ever erase. My life, you see, had always been a series of trials. My wife passed away far too early, when our son was still just a little boy. I had to carry on by myself, to be both a father and a mother to him, all while trying to build a career from nothing. I poured all of my love, all of my passion, and all of my strength into my only son. I wanted him to have a better life than I did. I wanted him to get a good education, to live a life of comfort and happiness. From a young age, it was clear my son wasn't a gifted student like some of the other children. He was a slow learner and didn't have much patience for his studies. Night after night, I would sit beside him at the kitchen table, patiently teaching him, one letter at a time, one math problem at a time. I never once scolded him or blamed him for his low grades. Instead, I always encouraged him, comforted him, and looked for any way I could to spark a love of learning inside of him. I truly believed that every child has their own unique path, and that as his father, it was my job to be by his side and help him carve it out. As he got a little older, I began to realize he had no interest in taking over the sushi business I had built. I won't lie, I felt a little pang of disappointment, but I respected his decision. I would not force him to follow a path I had chosen. I wanted him to follow his own passions, to do what he truly loved with his life. So, I did my research, I paved the way, and I got him enrolled in the prestigious Culinary Institute of America up in Hyde Park. I thought to myself that even if he didn't follow in my exact footsteps, if he could still make a name for himself in the culinary world, it would be a great comfort to me. I spent a great deal of money and effort to give him the best possible education, to help him build a bright future for himself. He went off to Hyde Park and started his new life as a student. I called him often to see how he was doing. I sent him money for his living expenses, and sometimes I would even drive all the way up there myself, bringing him his favorite homemade dishes. Even though we were apart, I believed the bond between a father and his son was unbreakable. I pictured a bright future, where he would graduate, find a steady job, get married, and I would finally get to spend my old age surrounded by children and grandchildren. But life, as you know, doesn't always go according to our plans. One day, I received a call from the school. They informed me that my son had suddenly dropped out. There was no goodbye, no phone call, no letter. He had simply disappeared from the school, vanished from my life like a ghost, leaving not a single trace behind. I was stunned. My heart felt like it was on fire. I tried every possible way to contact him. I called his phone, I sent messages, I even drove up to Hyde Park myself to look for him. But it was all for nothing. It was as if he had evaporated from the face of the earth. After days of searching fruitlessly, I finally learned that he had moved to Los Angeles. He was doing odd jobs out there, he said, to follow his passion. I couldn't understand it. What kind of passion could possibly make a man quit school, abandon his family, and disappear without so much as a single word? From that day forward, he was gone from my life for 17 years. 17 long years. Not one phone call, not one letter, not a single piece of news. During the holidays, when every other house was filled with the warmth of family gatherings, I would sit alone in my large, empty house, staring out the window with an ache in my heart. On the anniversary of his mother's death, I would light the candles and say my prayers, all by myself. For a long time I hoped. I waited. I longed for a call, a letter, any sign at all from him. But all I ever got was silence. A terrible, deafening silence that slowly killed a part of my soul, day by day. I came to believe that he must be dead. That he had gotten into an accident or fallen ill in some faraway, unfamiliar place, and I had never known. The pain of losing my only son ate away at my spirit every single day. I prepared myself for the worst. Or, I thought, perhaps I was the one who had died in his heart. This was an even more torturous thought. The idea that he was still out there, alive, but was treating me as if I no longer existed. He had simply erased my presence from his life. The love between a father and son, the gratitude for a lifetime of care, it all meant nothing. He had cast me aside like an old, worthless object. During those 17 years, I continued to run the sushi chain. I threw myself into my work, trying to bury the pain, to fill the vast, empty space in my heart. I tried my best to live a strong, dignified life, to prove to the world, and to myself, that I was not broken. But deep down, I was still just a lonely father, starving for a sign of love from his only son. Every night, I would look up at the starry sky and ask myself, I wonder if he ever looks up at these same stars. I wonder if he will ever remember this old father of his. Time marched on, carving a deep scar across my heart. I came to accept my reality. I learned to live with the loneliness. I assumed that this was how my life would be, that it would simply end quietly, without any reunion. I had resigned myself to a life that would just fade away into the quiet stillness of old age and accepted loneliness. But fate, it seems, had one more turn in store for me. It knocked on my door again, bringing with it an event so unexpected. It shook my entire world and began a turbulent new chapter in my life. It was on a chilly day in early winter. A cold wind was blowing through New York City, heralding the arrival of the harshest part of the season. I was in my office, going over the account books and making plans for the business. Suddenly, the office door opened, and a man walked in. I looked up, and my eyes locked on his face. It was a face I recognized, and yet, at the same time, it was the face of a stranger. It was my son whom I had not seen in 17 long years. Time had left its mark on him. There were wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and streaks of gray in his hair. He was no longer the innocent boy I remembered. He was a middle-aged man. I was completely frozen. My hand trembled, and the pen I was holding fell from my fingers. 1,000 questions flooded my mind. Why had he come back? What had he been doing for 17 years? Why did he leave without a word? And why, after all this time, was he standing in front of me now, without any warning? But he hadn't come back alone. With him was a woman who looked quite a bit younger than him, and a girl who appeared to be about 17 years old. The girl had long hair and large eyes, and her features strongly resembled my son's. My son just stood there and looked at me. There was no apology for his 17-year absence, no explanation for what he had done. He simply gave me a slight nod of his head. It was a formal, cold gesture, the kind you might give a business associate or a stranger on the street, not the father who had brought you into this world and raised you. "This is my daughter," he said. "Your granddaughter." He said it so casually, in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, as if he were introducing a friend, not a member of his own family. I was dumbfounded. A granddaughter? Since when did I have a granddaughter? I had never known she existed. When did he get married? Why didn't I know anything? "They're getting married next month." His next words left me completely paralyzed. Getting married? Whose wedding? No one had said who was getting married to whom. This child had never once called me grandfather, my own granddaughter, and I'd never heard her say the word, Grandpa, never once held her in my arms. All I knew was that she had appeared out of thin air and was getting married next month. It was all happening too fast, too suddenly. I didn't even have time to react. I looked over at the woman who had come with him. She didn't greet me, but just gave me a slight nod and a glance with indifferent eyes. And the girl, the one he said was my granddaughter, didn't even bother to look at me at all. She just stood there with a cold expression on her face, her eyes empty and distant, looking right through me as if I were a ghost, as if I didn't even exist. My heart seized in my chest. After 17 years of disappearance, he had returned with no apology, no explanation. He had returned with a new family, a wife and a child I never knew existed. And the very first thing he did upon his return was to announce a wedding. A wedding for which I had not been consulted, not been included, not been involved in any way whatsoever. Just then, a man I didn't recognize, someone who appeared to be an event planner, stepped forward and approached me. He held out a stack of papers. My hand was shaking as I reached out to take them from him. It was an invoice for the wedding. As I opened the folder, the first thing that assaulted my eyes was an astronomical figure, over $70,000. And attached to it was a small, cold, emotionless note, a single sentence that explained everything. "Because you're the oldest in the family." I thought my heart had stopped beating. $70,000. A staggering sum of money for a wedding I had absolutely no part in planning, for a granddaughter whose face I had never seen before this day. And the reason? Because you're the oldest in the family. It was such a flimsy excuse, such a transparent and utterly unacceptable exploitation. They hadn't come back out of love. They hadn't returned because they missed me or wanted to reconnect. They had come back for my money. They had come back to make me pay for a wedding. A wave of pain and humiliation washed over me, so potent it felt like I might drown in it. I had thought I was used to pain by now. I had thought I had grown accustomed to the loneliness, but in that one gut-wrenching moment, I realized something terrible. The pain was still there, and it was deeper and sharper than it had ever been before. They hadn't just abandoned me, they had returned to prey on me, to squeeze whatever they could from what little I had left. I stared at my son, then at the woman and the girl standing beside him. In their eyes, I was nothing more than a wallet, a bottomless source of funds to be tapped at their convenience. There was no love there. Gibia, there was no respect. There was no connection at all. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady myself, to anchor myself in the swirling storm of my emotions. This was not the time to fall apart. I had to be strong. I had to face this reality, no matter how much it hurt. I would not let them achieve their goal so easily. After receiving that invoice for over $70,000, a fire began to burn in my heart. The pain of betrayal and exploitation was a physical thing, a tight knot in my chest, but I forced it down, working hard to keep my face a blank mask, to show them nothing of the devastation they had caused. I looked at my son, searching his eyes for any flicker of remorse, any hint of an apology. But all I found there was indifference, a cold, flat emptiness. I took another deep breath and tried to make my voice as calm as possible when I spoke. "Will I be able to attend the wedding?" I asked. The words sounded distant to my own ears, as if someone else were speaking them. A tiny, fragile part of me was still clinging to a sliver of hope. Even if they were only using me for my money, surely they would at least allow me to witness my granddaughter's special day. Surely they would let me be a part of the family just for that one afternoon. My son looked at me as if I were a nuisance, an annoying fly buzzing around his head. His gaze flickered across my face for a half-second, full of undisguised irritation and impatience. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the woman beside him, as if seeking her permission. She simply offered a faint, contemptuous smile. Then my son turned back to me, and in a voice that was cold, clipped, and completely devoid of any emotion, he said, "You don't need to come." My heart constricted in my chest. The words were like a knife, twisting into a wound that was already bleeding freely. "You don't need to come?" I was his father. I was the grandfather of the child who was about to be married, and I was not allowed to attend my own granddaughter's wedding? And then, he delivered the final, cruelest blow. The other family, they said having someone so old there would just bring the mood down. And then he laughed. The sound of his laughter was grating, despicable. He was laughing while speaking those humiliating words, while casting me out of my own family. He felt no guilt. He had no consideration for my feelings whatsoever. In his eyes, I was nothing but a burden, an inconvenience, a feeble old man with no value beyond paying the bills. My daughter-in-law? No, that woman, she didn't invite me either. She just stood there in silence, a victorious glint in her eyes, as if she were taking pleasure in my suffering. She didn't open her mouth, didn't show me even a shred of respect. And the girl? The one he called my granddaughter? She didn't so much as glance in my direction. She stood there with a cold expression, her eyes vacant, as if I were invisible, as if I didn't exist at all. She felt nothing for me, her grandfather. She was perfectly willing to accept the money I was providing for her wedding, but she was not willing to accept my presence. I was speechless. The world around me felt like it was crumbling to dust. I was standing in my own home, yet I felt like a stranger, an intruder. I had been robbed not only of my right to attend my granddaughter's wedding, but of my dignity as a father and a grandfather. The engagement ring, specially ordered from Switzerland, cost $52,000. A glittering diamond ring, a symbol of love and happiness, purchased with my humiliation and my pain. I was the one paying for it, but I was not allowed to witness the happy day it represented for my own family. The feeling of being used, of being so thoroughly and completely trampled upon, left me without words. I had dedicated my entire life to this son. I had given him everything I had so that he could have a good life. And this was how he treated me. He had not only abandoned me for 17 years, but he had returned only to exploit me and insult me to my face. Pain, humiliation, and a white-hot anger surged through me. I took another deep breath, fighting back the tears that were burning at the backs of my eyes. I knew this was not the time to cry, not the time to break down. This was the time for action. I would not let them get away with this. I would teach them that a father, a grandfather, no matter how old, is not a toy to be so easily discarded. I turned my back on them and walked toward my study. My steps were heavy, but they were filled with a grim determination. I knew this was going to be a battle, a ruthless one, and I was ready for it. I stepped into my study and slammed the door behind me. The dry, sharp crack of the wood echoed in the sudden silence of the room, a final, definitive statement on everything that had just happened. I stood there, in the middle of the familiar space that had witnessed all the ups and downs of my life. My desk, the stacks of papers, the old photographs, it all seemed to blur before my eyes, lost in the chaos that was raging inside my mind. Pain, humiliation, and fury rose up in a suffocating wave, searing all my senses. I had tried so hard to keep my composure out there, to remain strong. But now, with the door closed and the brutal reality of the situation pressing in on me from all sides, it all came bursting forth. My hand reached for the phone. I called the bank directly. My fingers were trembling, but I forced them to be steady, refusing to betray any weakness, even to myself. The phone rang, the sound stretching out for what felt like an eternity. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. When someone finally answered, my voice came out clear and resolute, without a trace of hesitation. It was as if I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. I want to cancel the wire transfer for the Miller wedding. The person on the other end of the line sounded surprised. Sir, the transfer has already been confirmed and is being processed. Canceling it now could cause some complications. I cut them off, my voice colder and harder than I had ever heard it before. Cancel it, whatever it takes. And I want that account frozen, effective immediately. I want it so that no one can make a withdrawal except me. I didn't want anyone, especially not my son, to touch a single cent of that money. I wanted to sever all financial ties with them, completely and irrevocably. And if anyone, I continued, my voice low and dangerous, tries to withdraw money or make any transactions using my name, I want you to initiate legal proceedings immediately. I will not be held responsible. My words hung in the air, heavy and final. I no longer trusted them. I wanted nothing more to do with them. I wanted them to pay for their greed and their betrayal. After I finished speaking, I didn't wait for a reply from the bank. I hung up the phone, placing it firmly back on the receiver. Then, I unclasped the watch I had worn for decades, the symbol of time, of my constant, tireless effort. I slipped off the suit jacket I was wearing, the one I always wore for work, for meeting clients, the one I wore when I was at the peak of my career. I laid them both on the desk, as if I were shedding every burden, every responsibility, every chain that had ever bound me. I sat there. The room was shrouded in an absolute silence. The only sounds were the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the frantic drumming of my own heart. I gazed out the window. The sun was setting, leaving a deep, dark void in its wake. And then, I lowered my head to my desk. Tears began to fall, flowing down my cheeks without end. They were not tears of anger or frustration. They were tears of pure, unadulterated pain, of humiliation, of a disappointment so profound it could not be put into words. I wept, for the first time in nearly 50 years. For 50 years, I had lived a life of strength. I had overcome so many hardships, so many trials. I lost my wife. I raised my son alone. I built a career from nothing. I had faced countless storms, countless failures. But I had never cried. I always told myself I had to be strong. I had to persevere. I had to be a pillar of support for my son. But now, betrayed, insulted, and used so brazenly by that very son, I couldn't hold it in any longer. The tears were hot and salty, washing away all the pain that had been building up inside me for so long. I cried for myself. I cried for the cruel fate of a father betrayed by his own child. I cried for the illusion of a happy family, for the hope of a peaceful old age, all of which had just vanished like a soap bubble. I cried for the crushing loneliness, for the feeling of being abandoned, of being considered worthless, a burden. My son's words, his cruel dismissal, echoed in my ears like a curse, a scar that would never fade. You don't even have a family. I cried for the son I had loved, the son for whom I had sacrificed everything. He had, of his own free will, lost my love and squandered his chance to live a life filled with affection and respect. He had chosen the path of greed and ingratitude. I sat there and cried until the tears ran dry, until my body was so exhausted it could no longer move. When I finally lifted my head, my face was swollen and my eyes were red and raw. But deep within my heart, a strange stillness had begun to settle. I had cried it all out. I had shed every last burden. And now, I felt lighter than I had in years. I knew. This was the end of a father-son relationship that had been fractured for far too long, the end of the fantasy of a happy family. But it was also a new beginning. This was the beginning of my own life, a life where I wasn't bound to anyone, where I no longer had to endure suffering and betrayal. I would never look back at them again. I was going to live my life, my way, and I would show them that I was not a man who could be so easily broken. After that fateful phone call, and after the rare tears that hadn't fallen for nearly half a century, a strange sense of relief washed over me. I knew, deep in my bones, that I had done the right thing. I had severed all ties with the people who had trampled on my emotions and my dignity. I no longer felt the crushing weight of that illusion, the fantasy of a happy family, or the burden of a one-sided responsibility that would never be repaid. I didn't tell a soul about what had happened. I didn't complain about my pain or seek sympathy from anyone. I went to work just as I always did, continuing to manage my sushi chain, maintaining a calm and professional demeanor. I refused to let anyone see my weakness, and I certainly didn't want them to know about the family tragedy I was facing. I believed that the truth, in its own time, would speak for itself. And indeed, the truth began to speak, and its voice was far more powerful than any words I could have uttered. I was never truly alone. Over the long years of building my career, I had earned the respect and affection of many people. Old friends in the industry, long-time business partners, and loyal customers. They all knew me. They knew my career, and they knew my life. They knew I was a single father who had struggled to raise his son on his own. They knew I was an honest man, devoted to my work. The story of my son suddenly returning after 17 years of silence, only to demand that I pay for the wedding of a granddaughter I had never even met, and most shockingly, that I myself was not invited to this wedding, was not something that could be kept secret for long. I never found out exactly how the information leaked. Perhaps it was from my housekeeper, or from the people who saw my son when he returned, or maybe even from the wedding planners themselves. But in the end, it didn't matter. One morning, as I was sitting down with my tea and reading the news, I came across a small article on an online news site. It was just a few paragraphs, but it stopped me in my tracks. Miller Sushi founder, abandoned by son for 17 years. Now billed for wedding he's not invited to. The article wasn't just a piece of information, it was a scathing indictment, a stark and public exposure of my family's tragedy. Below the article, the reader comments began to pour in. First, there were thousands, and then tens of thousands. The vast majority of them expressed outrage and sympathy for me, along with harsh criticism of my son's actions. Overnight, the article went viral. It spread across social media platforms and online forums with astonishing speed. My story. The story of an elderly father abandoned and then exploited by his child struck a chord with millions of people. I had never imagined that my private life would become a spectacle for the entire world to see. I read every single comment, every word that was shared. Some people expressed their empathy, while others shared their own similar, painful experiences. Many of them harshly condemned the actions of my son and his wife. I felt a strange warmth reading the encouraging words from these complete strangers. They didn't know who I was, but they took my side. They spoke up for me. The whole world, it seemed, now knew my story. Everyone, that is, except them. My son. Or perhaps he simply didn't want to know. Didn't want to face the reality of what he had done. He was likely still living under the delusion that everything was under his control. That I was still the same weak, easily manipulated old father he had left behind. The day of the wedding arrived. I did not go. I stayed home quietly following the news. And then, a shocking piece of information was announced. Wedding of Miller Sushi founder's granddaughter canceled at the last minute. The reason given was this. The groom's family did not want to be associated with an ethical scandal. I smiled. It was a bitter smile, but at the same time, it was a smile of grim satisfaction. They had paid the price, not with money, but with their honor and their reputation. The very family who had agreed with the sentiment that I was too old and would bring the mood down, now had to cancel the wedding because they didn't want to be caught up in a public scandal. They were unwilling to have their own family's good name tarnished by the greed and filial impiety of my son and his wife. I could picture the scene in my mind, my son and his wife, panicking, utterly stunned by this turn of events. They had lost everything. They had lost the wedding, they had lost face, and they had lost the respect of everyone around them. Leffing, and most importantly, they had lost the fantasy that they could live a life of luxury by exploiting others. I didn't feel a sense of cruel delight. Instead, a deep and profound sense of relief washed over me. I hadn't had to do a thing. The truth had spoken for itself, and justice had been served in a way I could never have anticipated. I looked out the window. The morning light was streaming in. My life, after weathering so many storms, had finally found a small measure of peace. I had not been defeated. I had stood my ground, and I had won. Not through revenge, but through the truth, and through my own dignity. Since the wedding was canceled and my story became public knowledge, I imagine life for my son and his wife has been chaotic. I haven't looked into it, and I have no desire to know the details. I simply continued on with my quiet life, going to work, managing the sushi chain, but now, there is no longer a heavy weight on my heart. A few days later, I was sitting in my office when the door suddenly burst open. My son stumbled in. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes were swollen, and his clothes were disheveled. He was no longer the arrogant, indifferent man I had seen just a short time ago. In his place was a man consumed by extreme panic and terror. He walked into the center of the lobby of my flagship restaurant, the very place where he had once walked with such pride. And then, something happened that I thought I would never witness in my entire life. He fell to his knees. He actually got down on his knees, right there, in the middle of the restaurant lobby, in front of me. "Dad, forgive me. I'm so sorry, Dad. I was wrong. I was stupid, and I was too greedy. I lost my mind. Please, Dad, please forgive me." His voice was trembling, choked with sobs. Tears streamed down his face. He kept his head bowed, unable to look me in the eye. I looked down at him, but I felt nothing stir in my heart. It wasn't because I was cold, it was because I had been through too much pain, too much disappointment. This apology, coming now, was far, far too late. I was wrong. But please, don't abandon your granddaughter, please don't. Abandon her. He was still trying to make excuses, still trying to grasp at some last shred of hope. He was still thinking about his daughter, about what he stood to lose. I just looked at him. My eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. I had been waiting for this moment. I was ready for this confrontation. "Who am I in your family?" I asked. My voice was clear and firm, and the words rang out, striking him like a bolt of lightning. "Am I the one who pays the bills, or the one you insult?" He was silent. There was no reply. He couldn't answer the question, because he knew the answer was both. He had seen me as a source of money, a bottomless wallet, and he had insulted me, trampling my dignity without a second thought. I didn't wait for him to answer. I turned my back on him and walked over to my desk. On it, there was already a stack of papers. They were legal documents that I had prepared earlier, with the help of my lawyer. I picked up a pen and, without a moment's hesitation, I signed one of the documents. It was the document that removed his name from any claim to my estate. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a strange sense of release. I was completely severing every last connection to him. Not just emotionally, but financially as well. He would no longer have any right to the fortune I had worked my entire life to build. And that wasn't all. I had prepared another document as well. I was donating 70% of my assets to a charitable foundation that supports elderly people with no family to care for them. This was the money I had saved over a lifetime, the fruit of decades of back-breaking labor. I wanted this money to be used for a meaningful purpose, to help seniors who were in the same situation as me, abandoned by their children, with nowhere else to turn. I wanted to transform my own pain into something meaningful, to bring some warmth to those who were less fortunate. I set the documents down and looked at my son. He was still on his knees, his face ashen, his eyes lifeless, in a state of complete shock. He had lost everything. He had lost the wedding, he had lost his honor, and now? He had even lost the fortune he had so greedily tried to take for himself. I didn't say another word. I just looked at him. My eyes were filled with disappointment, but there was no longer any hatred there. The hatred had given way to peace. I had done everything I could. Now, it was all over. He remained on his knees for a while longer before he slowly, unsteadily, got to his feet. He didn't say anything. He just kept his head down and quietly walked out of my office. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the quiet room. I looked out the window. The sun was gradually setting. My life, after so many storms, had finally found its peace. I had not been defeated. I had stood my ground, and I had won. Not through revenge, but through truth, through my own dignity, and through forgiveness. This year, I turned 79. At this age, most people would think of retiring, of spending the rest of their days surrounded by children and grandchildren. But for me, life goes on, in my own way. I can still work, and I do. It is my joy, my reason for being. The sushi chain, the child of my soul that I spent my entire life building, has now been passed on to my top protege. He is young, talented, and most importantly, he values professional ethics above all else. I trust his abilities, and I believe he will continue to develop the chain, preserving the reputation and quality that I built. However, I still oversee the management from behind the scenes, participating in important decisions and serving in an advisory role. I can't completely let go of my soul's child. Every day, I go to my office, check the books, and talk with the employees. Work is a joy, and it is the driving force that keeps me going each day. I no longer live in that large, empty mansion. I now live in a small house on the banks of the Hudson River. It is a peaceful, quiet place. Every morning, I wake up early to tend to the plants in my garden, to care for my small flower beds. I read books, enjoy a warm cup of tea, and I eat my meals in peace.